Good afternoon. My today's guest is Dr. Roger Petry, Associate Professor at Luther College at University of Regina. So before to start our discussions, that's our format. I will introduce my guest, and I will share my screen for that. And then we will start our informal discussions. Dr. Roger Petry is an associate professor at Luther College at the University of Regina in the Department of Philosophy and Classics. He's a Rhodes Scholar and has obtained degrees in philosophy and mathematics from the University of Regina, philosophy, politics, and economics, and philosophical theology from the University of Oxford, and an interdisciplinary PhD awarded in 2008 through the Canadian Plain Studies program at the University of Regina. His doctoral thesis contrasts a university innovation for sustainable development in relation to commercialization and open source licensing strategies. Dr. Petry is a coordinator of the Regional Center of Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development in Saskatchewan, one of 174 RCs recognized globally by the United Nations University to help advance the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development from 2005 to 2014, and now the UNESCO Global Action Program on ESD and the 17th UN Sustainable Development Goals from 2015 to 2030. Dr. Petry was appointed Regional Advisor for RCs in the Americas by the UN University starting in this year. He's also the institutional lead on responsible consumption and production for the International Association of Universities, thematic cluster on higher education for sustainable development in support of the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 12. He grew up in Regina, Saskatchewan, and is married with 2 children. Okay, so that was actually what I was going to introduce my guest. Again, Doctor, how are you?
Oh, very good. Yeah, no, doing well. Yeah, it's good to have some time over the summer to get some projects that I've been delaying worked upon. So.
Okay, good. I tried to bring us back to the screen. I hope I will be able to do that. Okay, so we are back. I'm sorry, but yeah, I'm not very good in this techniques. But anyway, So I'm very glad to have you here, and I believe I gave the information that I found in the internet. So would you like to add something maybe I'm missing?
No, I think you gave a pretty good
Sure.
overview. I mean, I teach philosophy, so some of my key areas of philosophy are ethics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of sustainable development, and I regularly teach critical thinking or logic, as well as the introduction to philosophy courses. I've also done the course where we look at the ethics of science and technology. So that's an area for me because I've always been interested in innovation for sustainable development.
Yeah, thank you. I don't want to make a secret that we know each other for a long time, and I may forget sometimes. I may say Roger or Dr. Petry, so
That's
I
fine.
think it's understandable, and you can call me how you want. Yeah, and you know, the reason when I invited you and I told you that we would like to talk about education, the role of education in our society, our days, and education and sustainability. Um, when I came myself, I came to that kind of like not even conclusion. I got all these questions after completing one of my research case studies, research in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. We administered a survey in indigenous and non-indigenous communities of Prince Albert. We asked residents, 100 indigenous and 100 non-indigenous residents of Prince Albert, about their educational attainment, income, and employment rate. We try to find some correlation between educational attainment and payment, and to compare those two groups. We have lots of interesting conclusions, but one of them was that it looks like when you take two residents, indigenous and non-indigenous, with a lower education, let's say below the high school, indigenous people are paid less than non-indigenous people for the same job. But when you go to the higher education, people with university degrees, they are paid equally, regardless if they are indigenous or non-indigenous. It looks like higher education, it kind of helps us to get fair judgment regarding the payment. But that wasn't actually the goal, the purpose of our research, but we got that interesting conclusion. So, I mean, the fair judgment, in my understanding, it's not my area, it's kind of one of the foundations of a sustainable society. And you've been working in this area. You are one of the advocates of sustainable education and sustainability. Uh, what could you tell about that? I mean, how would you explain my conclusion? Does it make sense? And in general, what's the kind of correlation between education and sustainability of society?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So the first question about your study and the conclusion from it, I guess I would want to look at other studies too, because I'm not sure it's generalizable. I mean, for a long period of time, women have been had a very disproportionate lower levels of salary in well-established workplaces with high levels of academic credentials. So I think we'd have to look at a broader range to see whether it holds generally or not. I think partly why, in your case, it might hold a bit better is because when you're dealing with occupations with higher education credentials, you're probably dealing with workplaces which have, you know, more established human resource offices, you know, kind of standardized procedures that would allow for a kind of fairness or, you know, meritocracy within those structures in terms of the way jobs are posted, the salaries that are offered, and so on. And so I think, whereas if you were dealing with people without a formal higher education training, the kinds of occupations might be with, you know, small and medium-sized enterprises, self-employment, those kinds of things where, you know, the kinds of standards you might get would vary. So I think that that's probably part of a caution. I mean, we certainly have issues with you know, racism and so on, which are systemic, and oftentimes the rules, of course, are also systemically unfair. So we have to be mindful of that, where you've got ways in which the system is structured to perpetuate inequalities. Now, when we're dealing with sustainable development, of course, one of the key issues is equality, partly because we're dealing with mitigating issues of poverty, extreme poverty, and poverty comes in two forms. I mean, there's notions of absolute poverty where people can't get their basic needs met. And then we also have relative poverty, which talks about one's relationship to other people in terms of, say, income distribution and resource distribution. And that relative poverty has huge impacts as well, right? In a democracy, for example, even if people's basic needs are all being met, a person's economic and social power within the democracy is tied also to your relative wealth and income. So we can't, you know, in terms of having kind of viable democracies that are so central to people planning their long-term future, both individually and as a community, that type of inequality, that relative inequality, is also a big issue with sustainable development. So there's that issue of human inequality in terms of treatment, and also the issue of how it impacts the natural environment, because that's kind of a second major pillar of sustainable development, is addressing environmental degradation. And oftentimes, generally, people who are treated unfairly, where there's systematic inequalities for long generations of time, are also the ones who are living in natural environments that are degraded often. And also, if you are, you know, living day by day, the ability to plan for the long term, and sustainable development is also all about the long term, is eroded because you don't have the resources even to plan for one day, much less, you know, for the future generations. And so education is really important, partly because, as you say, it, you know, it has such a huge impact on people's, you know, future life chances in our society. But it also, of course, and I'm speaking as a philosopher, I mean, it also has a huge impact on your current quality of life, right? The ability to think deeply and profoundly about important issues, to make sense of those using the best knowledge available, including scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, good patterns of reasoning, right? That's where the philosopher in me kicks in. Education is deeply satisfying when it's education and not indoctrination. And our challenge is, of course, that as scholars, we educate. But other people in society, we have other educators, which include, you know, the media, it includes, you know, political parties. You've got things that educate that aren't necessarily interested in the free citizen thinking for themselves, but they're interested in indoctrination. And so sustainable development has to challenge that too.
Yeah, and I know that you're closely involved in UNESCO's initiatives, education for sustainable development, and you are a co-coordinator of RC Saskatchewan. Could you please talk about these initiatives in general? And I mean, I know that about those goals, goal number 1, 2, or 12. Maybe you could give some information about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the UN system has been thinking about sustainable development for a long time. And so even going back to 1987 with the Brundtland Commission, Our Common Future, that talked about what, a basic definition of sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present generation without undermining the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, which of course means living within the carrying capacity of our natural systems. It also means, of course, dealing with present day needs and aspirations of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized. And so the UN system, when they started thinking about that, they realized we have to look at different scales. We have to think about, well, what can communities do at the local level? What can we do at the national level? What can we do globally? And that meant building new institutions that we didn't have before, right? We haven't really thought about this kind of problem in a systematic and a holistic way. It also meant that we had to bring in new actors, new organizational players that we hadn't before. And it wasn't, and we had to measure new things, right? There were a lot of things that, in terms of our natural systems and human populations, we just did not know enough about. And so fast forward to 2002, when they called together the world leaders again in Johannesburg, and they realized they weren't making progress on sustainable development. And the key issue they realized, one of the people they'd forgot was the educators. They'd forgotten to put teachers and professors and scholars front and center of that initiative. And so I think it was the government of Japan that suggested to the UN that we needed a decade of education for sustainable development. And so all of a sudden, you weren't just talking about ministries of environment in government, you were talking about ministries of education who had, up to that point, hadn't played a central role. And so the issue was for the UN system, well, how do we advance this? And the UN University serves the UN system, but it's also a university to the extent it has academic freedom and all the things that we rely upon as scholars to produce good knowledge, right? That's robust, that's tested, peer-reviewed, all of those things. And so the UN University said, well, okay, how do we do this? We don't have a lot of resources for this, but could we allow regions to self-organize, to do the kind of education that they need for the kinds of local issues, sustainability issues they have? So for example, here in Saskatchewan, we have sustainability issues to deal with water, right? We live on a prairie ecosystem. We also have serious issues in terms of poverty, particularly when you talk about Indigenous communities, but also new immigrants coming to Saskatchewan. We've got issues with our development patterns. So historically, we're a resource-based economy with major issues in terms of mining and even agriculture. A huge problem nowadays is wetland drainage, all right? So if you come to Saskatchewan, the sustainable development issues are distinct here. And so we needed to set up regions that could link together the researchers, the scholars, the community practitioners at a regional level, at the same time giving the space a kind of freedom that we have at universities, academic freedom. So an RCE is basically that. It's a regional network of organizations and individuals, requires at least one higher education partner. Often it has more. It typically bridges between, say, rural and urban communities, between different cultural groups within those communities, between even academic organizations who often see themselves as competitors, bringing those people together in a spirit of goodwill, and with on almost primarily a volunteer basis, right? It's not resourced through the UN University. We basically have to self-mobilize our own resources. So we've always had a voluntary model here. Each RCE structures itself uniquely. Its governance patterns are their own. Its issues are their own. The educators in the local communities will be different depending on where you are. So that's why. But now we have over 174 of these RCEs, and in my mind, it's a whole new way of doing scholarship. It's a way that respects local people, local processes, local understandings of sustainable development, while sharing that at a global level with other RCEs so we can learn from each other.
Yeah, thank you. Another my question is maybe we cannot avoid this pandemic situation anyway, but it's mostly maybe it relates to education. Um, we all, I mean, you and me, and we all are forced now to change the format of our teaching because of this pandemic. So we're going to remote teaching, and but remote teaching, it's not just a change the form. This change of form, it kind of like causes the change of the context and maybe even the objectives of the education in total. Uh, so, in my knowledge, you know that better. I believe this existing teaching format that we all went through that, we are product of that format. It was established, I believe, about 800 years ago, 700, 800 years ago. Maybe it was just a time to make those changes, and this pandemic was kind of a trigger for those changes. What do you think about that? I don't have an answer. I just, but that's my
Yeah,
question.
I mean, it's interesting. We can look at major innovations in universities historically. I mean, if you think, well, I'm thinking, say, in the 1500s, that's when kind of the humanist colleges developed in Northern Europe, and they innovated by developing university chairs in specific languages to make sure that everybody in the university had a certain capacity to communicate. And then you think of the Royal Society and the rise of science, and each of those has their own methodologies. So the need for laboratories, for example, and journals, right? Academic journals. I always think that we don't really lose the older parts of the academy, but they get reinvented in these times of transition. And also we end up having new types of knowledge that emerge that affect the way the other disciplines work. So for example, as a philosopher, with the rise of science, of course, science was seen as natural philosophy, which was a kind of philosophy. Philosophers are kind of interesting because we pioneer whole new methods. That's kind of what we do. So, but as a philosopher, of course, to not listen to the knowledge coming out of science, I would be foolish, right? I mean, you know, that the traditional philosophy is greatly improved by listening to scientific discoveries and finding out how, and also talking about the role of science in society and all of that. I think now with the pandemic, you know, in a way, we've been forced back into ourselves, right? I mean, this has been a very philosophical time for a lot of people now that they are needing to stay within their own minds, but also within their own households and within their own communities. And so the opportunity for place-based knowledge, right? Geographically centered knowledge and teaching is really emphasized. And also the shift in terms of how we see ourselves in our society. So for instance, moving, I think, beyond just an employment paradigm to a livelihood paradigm. So think of how many people have been growing gardens this summer and doing things or preparing meals together as families, which for a lot of people they weren't doing. They were eating out every night. Well, that's a real shift in terms of our basic production. And the idea that universities could play a role in that shift to make a higher quality of life or better quality of life. So I think, I mean, there are dangers too, though. I think, you know, the shift to online learning was driven in part by a way to break down the scholarly identity so that it could be corporatized, right? So that you could have private for-profit universities, structures that, you know, would have maybe a professor develop some work, but then it ends up being given over to the private company, and you end up unbundling the occupation, so you hire people cheaply to do different parts. And that is, in a way, a threat to the scholarly identity. And so what needs to happen, I think, is to see how as scholars we embrace the shift to online learning in a way that reaffirms that the primary resources derived from scholarship go back into scholarship, and not into corporate ventures or what have you. And so I guess the fact that now all of us are being trained in these new methods will mean that perhaps as scholars we structure it in a good way. The other thing, of course, now the university campuses are these new spaces. If we aren't teaching as much on campuses as we used to, the opportunity to create living laboratories, right? The idea that we transform our campus spaces to do new things where we're doing sustainable patterns of development. And that's fascinating. And so I think we have some real opportunities. And of course, the ability to open up the university to the wider public once we are putting things more online, that particularly poor people or people in remote communities, rural communities, all of that, that's important. I think one of your other guests was talking about that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it kind of like brought me to another question. I think many years ago, I was a student. I read, I had at that time, I had time for reading science fiction, and I was a big fan of Isaac Asimov, and I read almost everything. And one of, maybe you remember that, one of his novel, the science fiction, was The Naked Sun. So that story is about a homicide investigation in a planet. It's called the Solaria, I believe. And in this, what that time, interestingly, when I read that first time, I didn't care what planet. For me, that I was focused on that as investigation. But when this pandemic started, I remember that that was a planet where people were isolated, self-isolated. For them, it's called a social distance. So, but they didn't have another person maybe in a radius of kilometers. So that was, and they had the very low density of population. I believe in the entire planet they had about thousands, 20,000 or something people, but mostly robots. They were serving people. That was a robot populated country. It's kind of like another story. But it was different kind of word, different behavior, and for them it was they would be disgusted if someone is present in your room or something. It's very interesting in that aspect. So I remember that later now. So before I didn't even care about that. Now we are kind of, I'm not telling that we're going that in that way, but in somehow this pandemic changed our behavior and about the social distancing, like many plans change, you know, I mean, we never talked about that. You can go to travel some country and you would not be able to come back. And those cruise ships, you remember, they were just the sort of going around is like phantoms, you know, those type of things. How do you, as a philosopher, how do you imagine our post-pandemic world? Would it be the same or something will stay with us? But it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the pandemic showed was how risky our current global system is, where we have very high levels of specialization, where our production chains are basically distributed across many territories that rely on very, fluid forms of transportation, and very resilient kind of supply chains, which we don't have, right? And also distribution chains, again, which turned out not to be all that resilient. And so the fact that we are now restricted in the way we are really pushes us into a new technological space, because we can now realize the value of having place-based production, 100-mile production, basically where a community realizes there is tremendous value in developing food self-sufficiency, food resilience, production of basic needs in terms of food, shelter, housing, housing, clothing even. And to the extent we have the technologies that are more accessible, right? More intermediate technologies, or sometimes it's called appropriate technologies. Our society has never gone there. We've either gone into high technology or low technology. We have a few specialists who do different kinds of high technology, and then we are basically not very functional in any other way. Whereas a shift to place-based local production relies on local knowledge and learning, and that's where, of course, local indigenous knowledge is important, the knowledge of small and medium-sized enterprises, the knowledge of vulnerable and poor people who often know their local areas the best, right? To customize our production to those realities, and to customize our production also to our local ecosystems, to say we don't have to build our houses all out of the same materials, right? It is absolutely strange that a house, say in Vancouver, right, in a temperate rainforest, looks the same as a house in Saskatchewan. That's just very strange. And of course, what it means is we're not capitalizing or maximizing on quality of life. We're meeting sort of basic standards that a market can generate, but we really haven't done that. So given the fact that a large number of people have more time on their hands, not necessarily willingly, of course, really opens up this space for volunteerism. But volunteerism really relies on participation. And so high-tech solutions don't typically allow for high levels of participation. Whereas if you are building, say, a straw bale house as a new kind of house, which makes sense on the prairies, that is something that people could come to weekend workshops for. That's something that they could, with just a moderate amount of training, all of a sudden be able to contribute a large part of their own sweat equity to that output. And especially if people with automation aren't doing particularly well in the economy, that might be a much better trade-off in terms of their time and quality of life to build a $30,000 house using 80% of their own time rather than having a $500,000 mortgage, right? So if we think about universities, we're in a space where even though the market might not be providing those kinds of new forms of production, we can pioneer it, right? Because we're interested in the best forms that address people's quality of life and so on. So, that's the real sweet space, is how do we generate that participatory intermediate technologies that really address people's basic livelihood needs and is tied to making use of things on the surface of the planet, right? Our ecosystems, right? Instead of, the last 300 years, we drill into the ground to get these resources that are very difficult to get at, high energy use, high polluting, rather than just looking at what's on the surface or within 10 feet of the surface in order to build our buildings, right? And that's a whole area of discovery that we haven't looked at all, right? Even our engineering, right? Our engineering intermediate technologies that ordinary people can build with maybe a 3D printer and using some local biomass. I mean, that again is something that it's a whole new vista, right? And I think it's more competitive. And with the resources now that are available, that is people with a lot more time on their hands, just in part because automation is going to wipe out a lot of employment. And also with COVID, governments are going to be in debt for a long period of time. Our market systems are very fragile right now. The likelihood of their building back a lot of employment isn't all that realistic. And so we need local communities building new things. And that's where the university is really in the driver's seat now, because of all the organizations that are more resilient in terms of COVID. I would think the university is one of them. And so we have a moral obligation to step up. But that means, working in an interdisciplinary way, talking to local community practitioners, trying to figure out what the local best ways of making a house or harvesting and making use of water, or building up natural spaces for plants and animals, right? I mean, that's very new activity.
Yeah, it's very interesting. This is again, this pandemic, it kind of like made some changes to the priorities of media. Like suddenly, the media remembered about the healthcare professionals, mathematicians who can make predictive models, and philosophers who can talk about living in the isolated environment, and etc. So I see this really. I watch the news at certain hours normally, about 10 or 11 p.m. Mostly, I was kind of disregarding, to be honest, half of that, because most of that was about show business. So that's maybe it's a good thing, but it's not my priority. But now I noticed that I watch the entire news, because mostly that's about, kind of like scientists, there's medicine, about education stuff. It looks like media changed the priority. But still, it's not the education is not their number one priority. I mean, if someone teach you, not pandemic time and other time, if someone told you every day, every hour that, okay, so you have to wash your hands, don't drink the sanitizers, that's poison, no one would care about that. But if maybe the most powerful man in the earth says that can you inject the sanitizer, all media talks about that right away. So first, why do you think the media is not that much kind of attractive uh, with respect to media education, and maybe it's just a boring, or we don't have that way, we cannot find that way for expressing this education related news in more interesting way. To be honest, one of the purposes why I started this project, I see I have something to say, and I know many of my colleagues, we have something to say, to express, but for media, it's not that much, attractive. So that's why that was one of the reasons why I started the project. What do you think, would that the media change its priorities? Would we finally understand that the technologies is not something like to show those fascinating robots and get excited, but actually it's something that will help us in our everyday life. So the Zoom is not something like you can, then how comes that two people can see each other? But apparently it becomes the only way for communicating with your relatives. So what do you think, how the media would change?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge, in part, I mean, the media, there's different kinds of media, of course, and of course, the corporate media the traditional corporate media has been challenged in a number of ways. In its basic business model has been challenged, right, through social media and new ways that people get information and so on. And I guess the challenge there is the ability for the professional journalist and the investigative reporter. A lot of the resources that traditionally went into that were lost, right? And that meant that news sources, news companies ended up getting kind of very sensational news that was easy to get. So you walk down to the courthouse to find out, how many people were killed today, rather and the stories of the case. But despite all the news about criminal activity, say, you know no more about whether the crime rate in Regina has gone up or down, right? You're not really informed about it, despite how much, coverage there is, right? And so that's a challenge, is that these companies no longer have the resources for investigative reporting. And then, of course, social media doesn't have the norms of the professional journalist either, right? And then you've got news companies that basically have no commitment to the ethics of journalism, the professional ethics, and were, established for other purposes, right? So, somebody said, now I don't know if I'd have to check into this, but that basically Fox News was established at the time of the Gulf War in order to basically provide, I don't know if we call it propaganda, but support for that war. Well, then, of course, at its very inception, it was never designed as a news outlet in the service of citizens, right? In the sense of, what we call the fourth estate, or a structure there that's there to serve citizens. So in a way, universities are interesting because, we aren't supposed to serve governments. We serve citizens in general, right? We're like the law courts. We're not supposed to be serving the government of the day. The law courts are there to support basic citizen rights. And so I guess in this time, why are you seeing more faculty, professionals, scholars on the news, is because I think maybe the media rediscovered, oh, wait a second, here is this whole institutional structure that is sitting on the knowledge that we need. And this is life or death knowledge. So in a way, it was finally the sensational news of life and death combined with the fact that there were people who knew, about the kinds of things we needed to be doing. And so maybe there is a happy marriage there. But on the other hand, part of the challenge too is that the traditional media focuses on the short term, whereas sustainable development focuses on, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 100 years down the road. What types of lifestyle changes and livelihood changes do we need to do well in the future? And that's not just a problem with the corporate media. That's a problem with business in general and politicians, right? They have the short-term election cycle every 4 years, or the business cycle reporting every quarter. There isn't the time horizon built into things. Whereas universities, we actually do have that time horizon, right? We are entrusted to bring forward this knowledge through time, to preserve and add to it. And we've got structures that enable that, and that also enable long-term research, right? 10-year, 20-year, 30-year research projects. Or philosophers, we're looking at some of the questions that were asked, 2,000 years ago, and still working on those questions. So we're in a space that, as universities, we can serve citizens in the way we need to, and in part the way we were designed to have the independence, so that citizens aren't manipulated, right, in terms of the information.
Yeah, I like that conclusion. I mean, that statement that we are here to serve the citizens, not the governments of the day, or the governments as institutions, as for people. So I hope our today's discussion will be interesting, at least for some people. So thank you very much, and I hope to continue our discussions, because we need nowadays, maybe we need technicians, professionals, some professionals in some certain areas. But as you mentioned, these days we had a little bit more time, maybe, for looking inside of ourselves, and it's a more philosophical question. So if you have time, and if you will have interest, I would like to continue that discussion. And by that time, I will try to learn some philosophical terminology, so that I wouldn't kind of like make that mistakes in the use of proper terminology. So hopefully we will come back again and continue our discussions. Thank you very much for today. That was very interesting for me.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.